Imagine looking at an X-ray of a broken arm. It's binary.
Right.
Clean. It's either broken or not broken.
Right.
You see that jagged white line on the black film, and the doctor points at it and says, there it is. That's the reality of the situation.
Yeah, and it gives us this sense of total control. I mean, we really like our reality to be highly visible, easily categorized, and undeniably concrete.
Exactly. But imagine pointing that exact same X-ray machine, that expectation of clean, concrete answers, at the fundamental laws of the universe.
Oh, yeah.
You point it at gravity, or the speed of light, or the quantum realm, and you suddenly realize the machine itself is showing you a picture you don't actually understand at all.
Because it's giving you the what, right, but it's completely failing to explain the why.
Exactly, and that is the uncomfortable truth lurking at the very bottom of modern physics.
It really is. I mean, we have equations that predict how things move with just staggering, decimal point accuracy.
Right, like we can land a rover on Mars.
Exactly. But if you ask the field, well, why do those specific numbers make the universe work? The standard model basically just shrugs.
It's wild. And I want you, listening to this deep dive right now, to really hold on to that feeling of structural uncertainty, because today we are going to completely dismantle that standard X-ray machine.
We really are. We're looking at the foundational numbers that govern literally everything you interact with.
The physical constants of nature.
Yeah.
Because we grow up learning that these constants are just the arbitrary rules of the game. They are random numerical values we happen to have measured in a laboratory, and we just plug them into our math homework to, get an A.
Right. You just accept them.
But what if they aren't arbitrary at all? What if the numbers that dictate how stars burn and how atoms hold together are actually, fossils? What if they are the petrified mathematical remains left behind by the very creation and emergence of reality itself?
Which is such a crazy thought.
Yeah.
But that is the core provocation of this brilliant and frankly disruptive 2026 paper by Philip Lilien. It's titled Constants Ontology Paper A. And it introduces a concept called the coherence closure framework.
And it demands a profound rethinking of what physical laws fundamentally are.
It really does. It shifts us away from just measuring things toward understanding how they came to be measurable in the first place.
So the mission for this hour is ambitious. We want to completely reframe how you view physical reality.
A small task, right?
Oh, yeah, super easy. We want to take you from a universe where math's just a human-invented tool we use to measure things to a universe where math is the actual structural scaffolding of existence.
And to get there, we really have to start by identifying this massive blind spot in standard physics. Lilien calls it the flat list problem.
Okay, let's unpack this. What exactly is standard metrology like, the science of measurement, doing wrong when it looks at these fundamental numbers?
It fundamentally comes down to how we categorize information, right? And how we prioritize utility over meaning. So in modern physics, we have a literal list of fundamental constants. You have the speed of light, Planck's constant, Boltzmann's constant, the gravitation constant.
The classic numbers.
Exactly, the greatest hits. And standard physics treats all of these as if they belong to the exact same family of objects.
They're just on a list.
Yeah, they are all just undifferentiated numerical parameters. You grab one off the shelf, you plug it into your equation, and like you said, the rocket goes to Mars.
But if the rocket successfully goes to Mars, someone playing devil's advocate might say, well, who cares?
Right, it works.
Yeah, isn't it good enough that the math works? If treating them as a flat list of ingredients gets the job done, why is that actually a problem?
Because while it is operationally incredibly useful, it is ontologically imprecise.
Okay, ontology, the study of being.
Exactly. Physics has historically fallen into a trap, often summarized by the phrase, shut up and calculate.
I heard that, yeah.
We know how to use the numbers, but the ontology, what things actually are in the fabric of reality, is completely flattened out. Right. The paper argues that a thermodynamic conversion constant, which deals with heat and large collections of atoms, simply shouldn't be grouped in the exact same explanatory layer as a fundamental geometric rule, or like a root condition of reality itself.
Because they aren't doing the same job.
They're not doing the same kind of work in the universe at all.
I was reading this part of your notes. It struck me, it's like saying the concrete foundation of a house, the paper that the architect's blueprints are printed on, and the specific shade of blue paint you chose for the living room are all the exact same kind of building material.
Just because they happen to show up on the same itemized invoice from your contractor.
Yes. Exactly.
The contractor invoice is a great way to visualize the error here. Yes, the foundation, the blueprint, and the paint are all necessary to call the house finished from our human perspective.
Sure.
But their relationship to the existence of the house is fundamentally different. I mean, you can change the blue paint to red, and the house still physically stands. If you remove the concrete foundation, the house collapses. If you don't have the conceptual blueprint, you don't even have the potential for a house to emerge.
But standard physics just puts the paint, the concrete, and the blueprint on one single list and calls them all house numbers.
Exactly. It's a massive oversimplification.
So if we throw out the flat contractor's invoice, what are we replacing it with? How does Lilien's framework suggest we organize the building blocks of reality?
Well, the coherence closure framework provides this very elegant stratification. It organizes the constants into a 5-tier hierarchy based on what it calls their ontological depth.
Ontological depth, okay.
Yeah, we have to stop asking what number is this and start asking at what layer of reality's emergence does this specific constant become necessary.
And those 5 tiers, moving from the absolute deepest, unseen foundations up to the surface reality we walk around in, are, let me make sure I have this right, root constants, recursive constants, compound constants, transcendental constants, and finally, empirical constants.
You got it. And exploring those 5 tiers is exactly how we are going to spend our time today. We're basically going to build the universe from the absolute bottom up, logically.
All right, let's get right into the dirt then. Tier 1, the root constants. And specifically, we're looking at a subcategory here called the seed equations. Because before we can measure a physical universe, before we can talk about planets or atoms or even empty space, we have to ask, what allows a universe to emerge in the first place?
Right. And to even begin discussing layer 1, we have to leave the laboratory behind entirely.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning root constants are strictly pre-empirical.
So for the listener who might be wondering how we test this, you literally cannot build a machine to measure them.
You cannot build an instrument to detect a root constant, because a root constant is the prerequisite condition for the instrument to even exist.
Oh, wow.
It's the prerequisite for the particles the instrument is made of and the dimensional space the instrument occupies.
Because if the root constant wasn't there, the machine wouldn't be there.
Exactly. They're the absolute invariance conditions required for fields and time to appear at all. They govern the mathematical possibility of emergence itself.
And what's fascinating is that the framework doesn't just hand us vague philosophical concepts like potential or existence. It anchors these pre-empirical rules to formal source equations.
Right, but we should clarify, these aren't equations that spit out a measurable number like 3.14.
No, they are generative relations. They show where the constant derives its identity.
Exactly. There are 8 root constants in total, split into 2 groups of 4. And the first 4 are the seed equations. These are the absolute rock-bottom preconditions for reality.
Let's dig into the first seed. It's called the infinite coherence constant. And the source equation for this is 0 to the power of 0 equals 1.
Yes.
Okay, hold on. I need to stop you there. Because I remember enough calculus to know that if you put 0 to the power of 0 into a calculator, it gives you an error.
It does, yeah.
Mathematicians argue about this all the time. It's often considered an indeterminate form. You can't just change the rules of standard math to make a philosophical point. How does Lilien justify using a debated mathematical quirk as the literal foundation of reality?
That is exactly the kind of skepticism the paper anticipates. And it's crucial here to separate the operational math you do on a calculator, which is dealing with continuous limits and curves, from the ontological discrete combinatorics Lilien is describing.
Okay, so it's a different branch of math.
Exactly. In set theory and combinatorics, 0 to the power of 0 is strictly defined as 1. It represents the number of ways you can map an empty set to an empty set.
Which is one way.
There is exactly one way to do it, the empty map itself.
Okay, so in the math of arranging things rather than the math of drawing curves, it holds up perfectly.
It's entirely rigorous in that context.
But what does mapping an empty set have to do with the universe existing?
Conceptually, it expresses unity, the number 1 emerging from apparent nullity, which is the zeros. It is the root invariant of intelligible being.
Intelligible being.
Yeah, it states mathematically that coherence is a non-negatable presence prior to dimensionality. You cannot have absolute philosophical nothingness as the ultimate foundation, because emergence obviously happened.
Right. We are here having this conversation.
Exactly. So for emergence to happen at all, some fundamental coherence must be present, even if there is nothing there yet.
It's almost like the mathematical version of I am that I am.
That's a great way to put it.
Before there is a where or a when, there just is a coherent potential.
Precisely. The infinite coherence constant is the principle that coherence cannot be negated without presupposing coherence. It proves that coherence must exist before emergence can even initiate.
Okay, so we have unity from nothingness, that's seed one, but pure unity is just a stagnant single point, right? A perfectly unified universe is honestly pretty boring.
Extremely boring.
How do we get structure and complexity without breaking that underlying unity?
That requires the second seed equation, the symmetry coherence constant.
And the math here is 0 factorial equals 1.
Yes. Factorial closure.
For anyone whose high school math is a bit rusty, a factorial, which looks like an exclamation point next to a number, is when you multiply a number by all the whole numbers below it.
Right.
So 3 factorial is 3 times 2 times 1, which is 6. It basically calculates the number of ways you can arrange things.
Correct. If you have 3 books, there are 6 ways to arrange them on a shelf. But what happens when you have 0 books?
How many ways can you arrange nothing?
Mathematically, there is exactly one way to arrange 0 items. The arrangement of nothing is still a single valid state. Hence, 0 factorial equals 1.
But in the coherence closure framework, this obviously goes far beyond arranging books on a shelf.
Oh, absolutely. This represents the organizing principle of order, resonance, and integrative complexity. It establishes the principle that ordered composition preserves unity.
So it's not just that things exist, it's the rule that when things differentiate, when they become complex, they don't fracture the underlying foundation.
Consider the alternative. If differentiation meant breaking unity, the moment the universe expanded past a single point, it would have dissolved into absolute, unrecoverable chaos.
It would have just shattered.
Exactly. Symmetry in this framework isn't just a visual mirror image, like the left and right sides of a butterfly. It is ordered unity preserved across differentiation.
Wow.
When root coherence becomes structure through ordering, it doesn't lose itself. It mathematically returns to unity.
So if you're listening and looking around your room right now, this equation is the reason the universe isn't just pure screaming static.
Literally, yes.
It's the reason atoms can form molecules, and molecules can form cells, and everything holds its shape instead of just flying apart into random noise.
It is the invariant rule by which form is allowed to self-organize.
Which brings us to the third seed, and this one is arguably the most famous equation in the paper. The asymmetry resonance constant. The source equation is negative e to the power of ein times pi equals 1.
This is a shifted version of Euler's identity.
Right, which is normally written as e to the I pi plus 1 equals 0.
Yeah, Euler's identity is famous for tying together all the fundamental mathematical constants into one perfect equation. But Lilien shifts the algebra so it equals positive 1.
Why do that?
The focus here is on the phase displacement.
Okay, if you're taking the dog for a walk right now and your brain just short-circuited at imaginary numbers and phase displacement, let's ground this.
Good idea.
The previous two equations were all about perfect unity and perfect order. But a perfectly ordered, perfectly symmetrical universe is completely static.
It's a frozen crystal. Nothing happens.
So we need a spark to start the engine of reality. I visualize it like a perfectly still, frozen pond, pure, unbroken symmetry. Nothing will ever happen until a tiny drop hits the surface.
Right.
This equation, this asymmetry resonance constant, is that first drop.
That analogy captures the mechanics perfectly. In complex numbers, multiplying by I represents a rotation, a phase shift. This equation represents the minimal deviation from pure coherence required for emergence to actually initiate.
So we need a little bit of imperfection.
Yes, asymmetry enters the system through a rotational phase shift. But crucially, because the entire equation resolves to equal 1, that displacement remains governed by closure.
Oh, I see. It's a controlled deviation. The drop hits the pond, but the pond doesn't explode. It ripples.
It proves that asymmetry is not a failure or a breaking of coherence. It is coherence displaced into generative resonance.
Generative resonance.
Yeah, it's the first actual dynamic movement of reality, mathematically secured against flying into chaos.
And that movement needs somewhere to go, right? It needs an arena to ripple through, which sets us up for the fourth and final seed equation, the dimensional genesis constant.
Yes.
The source equation is infinity to the power of 0 equals 1.
This is where we finally get the concept of space. But we have to completely discard how standard physics usually treats it.
Well, standard physics, going back to Newton, usually treats space as a pre-existing box, right? Like an empty theater stage where all the particles and planets were eventually placed.
Yeah, the Newtonian view treats space as a primitive given. It's just there.
Yeah.
But this equation, infinity to the power of 0 equals 1, expresses bounded dimensionality emerging from unbounded potential.
Let's break down the math there. Any normal number to the power of 0 is 1.
Right.
But infinity isn't a normal number. It's a concept of the unbounded. So unbounded potential raised to the 0th power, which we established earlier, maps to the coherence of an empty set, results in a unified one, boundedness.
Exactly the right interpretation. It proves mathematically that space isn't a primary empty container.
It's not a box.
Space is the structured actualization of coherence. Dimension only appears when unbounded potential limits itself into bounded closure.
Wait, so space didn't exist waiting to be filled. Space was actively generated by infinite coherence deciding to limit itself so that interaction could happen.
Boundedness emerging from the unbounded.
That is beautiful.
These four-seed equations give us the absolute foundational logic, right? Coherence exists, 0 to the 0 is 1. Coherence is preserved through complex order. 0 factorial is 1. Coherence shifts dynamically to create action negative e to the I pi is 1. And unbounded coherence limits itself to create dimensional space, infinity to the 0 is 1.
My mind is officially stretching, and we're only halfway through layer 1.
We have a long way to go.
We have the abstract seeds of reality. We have existence, order, action, and space. But how does this pure abstract math actually cross the line into something that eventually becomes physical?
That transition requires the second half of the root constants. We must move from the seed equations to the threshold equations.
Thresholds. So boundaries or limits that must be crossed for something new to happen.
Exactly. These four equations dictate the specific boundary conditions under which root coherence transitions into structured, experiential, or sequential states.
Okay.
They govern how the abstract potential we just discussed becomes actualized.
Let's look at the first of these thresholds, which is the fifth root constant overall, the quantum coherence bound. The equation is simply C sub q is less than or equal to C sub max.
Right. This defines the upper envelope of coherence in a projected reality.
Let's think about a quantum system.
Like particles doing weird things.
Yeah, you have particles existing in multiple states at once, superposition, quantum entanglement. The framework states that a quantum field can only hold a finite amount of this pure coherence before it reaches a structural limit.
That limit being C sub max, the maximum sustainable load of weird, smeared-out quantum potential.
And when the coherence load of a system exceeds that bounded limit, something called decoherence forces a transition.
Correct.
Infinite coherence belongs exclusively to the pure root layer. But quantum coherence, the kind that exists in projected physical reality, is bounded. It has a strict limit.
If you've ever read about tech companies trying to build quantum computers, you know exactly what this looks like in practice.
Oh, yeah. It's incredibly difficult. They have to keep the quantum chips at absolute zero and perfectly isolated because the moment the system gets too complex or interacts with the environment, it decoheres.
It loses its quantum magic.
Right, it turns into regular, boring matter. This equation is the fundamental law dictating why that happens.
Exactly.
It's the rule that says quantum weirdness can't scale up infinitely. A single electron can be in two places at once, but a baseball can't, because the baseball's coherence load is vastly beyond C sub max.
It bounds quantum behavior into a sustainable envelope, forcing potential to eventually choose a definitive state.
Which flows perfectly into the next threshold, and this is where physics starts to sound a little bit like philosophy.
It does bridge that gap, yes.
The observer collapse threshold. P sub obs is greater than or equal to P sub collapse.
This directly addresses the most notorious puzzle in quantum mechanics, the measurement problem.
The idea that looking at something changes it.
Exactly. The framework explicitly incorporates observation into the fundamental mathematical architecture of reality. This equation represents the coherence field pressure necessary for a fluid structure to collapse into a determinate solid form.
Wait, are you saying that a human being looking at something is what mathematically makes it solid? Because that sounds like the kind of pop quantum mysticism that physicists usually hate.
Right, and the paper is very careful here. An observer in this context doesn't necessarily mean a human with a clipboard.
Okay, good.
An observer is any system that extracts information from the quantum field, forcing a relational interaction.
A relational interaction.
Collapse occurs when that observer-field interaction reaches a specific pressure threshold, P subcollapse. At that point, the coherent potential can no longer remain fully distributed. It is mathematically forced to resolve into a determinate appearance.
So discreteness, the fact that matter exists as localized solid stuff that you can touch, is observer-mediated.
Yes, It implies that discreteness is not primitive. The universe doesn't start as a bunch of tiny, hard, pre-existing billiard balls bouncing around.
It starts as a cloud of potential.
It starts as distributed potential, and discreteness is produced only when coherence crosses an interaction boundary.
It literally takes a relationship to make reality solid. The potential and the measurement or observation of that potential.
It forces us to ask deep questions about what interactions constitute a measurement. But the mathematical threshold for that collapse is undeniably foundational to how reality becomes physical.
And speaking of observation, the seventh root constant takes that concept to its ultimate conclusion. When I read this one, I actually had to put the paper down and walk away for a minute.
I know exactly this one you're talking about.
The self-referential coherence constant. The equation is C sub self equals C as a function of C.
This is deeply profound. This equation defines the resonance density required for subjectivity, for agency, for the concept of an I to emerge in the universe.
The actual lived experience of being a self. The framework is boldly claiming there is a fundamental mathematical constant for consciousness.
Yes, it is arguing that subjectivity isn't just a random, messy accident of biological evolution.
Right.
It happens when the structural coherence of a system becomes so dense and so integrated that it does not merely organize external relationships, but becomes recursively available to itself.
Recursively available.
It is when coherence forms an internal mirror relation, C as a function of C, the universe mathematically reflecting upon its own coherent state.
It's the universe waking up and looking at its own hand.
Exactly.
And this framework posits that this isn't magic, it's a threshold event. It requires a specific density of resonance to trigger that internal mirroring.
If we follow the logic of the framework, it means the mathematical potential for consciousness was baked into the threshold rules of reality from the very beginning.
Alongside the rules for space and quantum collapse.
Right. Subjectivity is a structurally necessary feature of reality, not a bystander.
That is so heavy.
It completely reframes consciousness.
But we still have one more root constant in layer 1 to cover before we can actually start building physics. The temporal modulation constant.
Yes.
The equation is the derivative of c with respect to tau is not equal to 0.
This is the calculus of time. The derivative of coherence with respect to a local ordering parameter cannot be 0. This is the absolute threshold condition for time to exist.
So what does this actually mean for how we experience time? Because we usually think of time as a relentless ticking clock in the background of the universe.
Right.
It ticks whether we are moving or standing still.
We view it as an empty runway where the events of reality take off and land.
Exactly. But this derivative equation says time isn't a container at all. Time only appears when coherence is modulated, when it actively varies across an ordering parameter.
If there is no variation in coherence, there is no sequence. Without modulation, causality literally does not exist.
Wow.
Time is simply the ordered appearance of coherence variation.
Let's make sure the listener grasps this because it's a massive paradigm shift. If the universe completely stops changing, if not a single particle moves, no heat transfers, nothing fluctuates, time doesn't just pass quietly in the background with nothing happening.
No.
Time itself mathematically ceases to exist.
The math is explicit. Where coherence does not modulate, time does not appear as progression. Time is not a dimension you travel through. It is a measurement of the universe updating its own coherence.
Okay, take a breath. That concludes layer 1. The foundation.
We made it through the roots.
We have the absolute preconditions of the seed equations and the boundary rules of the threshold equations. We have existence, space, the quantum limit, observation, consciousness, and time.
Quite a list.
But none of this is the physical stuff we see around us. How do these abstract pre-empirical rules become the actual physical fields and equations we use in science?
To see that, we have to move up the ontology pyramid. We transition from root constants to tier 2, recursive constants.
These are the echoes.
Echoes is a really good way to frame it. Root invariants define the deepest conditions at layer 1. But recursive constants arise when those root invariants repeat themselves across the emergent layers of reality.
Okay.
The universe doesn't just do something once and forget about it. Reality stratifies into fields, into chemical geometry, into matter, into biological life.
And as reality differentiates into those different layers, the foundational rules from layer 1 have to carry forward. They can't be left behind.
But they aren't simply copy-pasted in identical form.
Right.
The paper describes a recursive constant as a modulated recurrence. It bridges the gap between pre-empirical ontology and measurable physics. It acquires a domain-specific scale while preserving its original mathematical signature.
Let's go back to analogy to make this tangible. I think of it like a musical motif in a symphony.
Okay, I like that.
You have a root melody, say a simple four-note progression. That's your layer 1 root invariant. In the first movement of the symphony, that melody is played very softly, abstractly, by a single violin. That's the quantum field layer.
Right.
In the second movement, the exact same notes are played aggressively by a heavy brass section. That's the physical matter layer. Later, a full choir sings it with complex harmonies. That's the biological layer.
It sounds completely different.
It has different volume, different texture, different instrumentation, but structurally and mathematically, it's the exact same underlying tune.
That is a highly accurate conceptualization. Let's look at the symmetry coherence concept we discussed earlier, the rule that order preserves unity.
The 0 factorial equals 1.
Yes. It starts as a pure ontological rule. But as reality emerges, that symmetry recurs as the stability of gauge fields in quantum mechanics.
Okay.
Then it modulates and recurs again as the rigid crystal lattice structures in chemistry. And it recurs again as bilateral symmetry in biological organisms.
Wow.
The invariant signature of the tune is preserved, but modulated by the physical medium it passes through.
So tier 2 is the mechanism of reality echoing its own foundational rules at larger, more complex, and more tangible scales.
Yes. But before we move to how those specific physical domains actually interact with each other, the framework requires us to look slightly sideways, or rather skip up the pyramid to tier 4, transcendental constants.
Wait, we're skipping tier 3 for a second?
We have to, in order to maintain the logical flow of how reality is constructed.
Okay.
Before physical domains like energy and mass can bridge together, they have to obey universal structural rules. Tier 4 contains the mathematical closure invariants.
These are the numbers that haunt everyone from high school math class. Pi, E, and phi, the golden ratio.
And it is vital to understand a key distinction the paper makes here. Transcendental constants are not physical measurements.
Right, you don't take a ruler into a vacuum and measure pi.
You can measure the circumference of a physical wooden circle, but pi itself is a formal mathematical closure operation. It governs rotational closure and the ratio of a boundary to a center.
And E, Euler's number. We use that for calculating compound interest in banking, but what is it fundamentally?
It governs continuous recursion, exponential growth, and decay. It is the mathematical rule for how a system continuously compounds upon its own previous state.
And phi, the golden ratio, what's the rule there?
It governs harmonic proportion, self-similarity, and scaling. How a part relates mathematically to the whole, ensuring structural integrity as things grow.
So if these are purely mathematical formal rules, why are they sitting at tier 4 in a framework about physics constants?
Because physics cannot become mathematically intelligible without them. As the universe projects out from root coherence into physical domains, that projection must follow formal structural rules to avoid collapse.
It has to have grammar.
Exactly. The universe is mathematically obligated to use pi whenever coherence becomes expressible as rotation or curvature. It is obligated to use E whenever energy or biological systems grow or decay. These are the invariant mathematical forms of projection.
They are the geometric grammar of the universe. Reality has to speak the language of pi if it wants to make a planet spin or an orbit close.
Exactly. They are the structural rules that ensure that as reality gets more complex, it remains mathematically coherent.
Okay, let's take stock. We have the foundational root seeds, tier 1. We have the recursive echoes building up layers of reality, tier 2. And we have the mathematical grammar of the transcendentals governing the shapes of that reality, tier 4.
Right.
Now, we have actual distinct physical regimes. We have energy, we have mass, we have temperature, we have quantum action. But these things don't exist in isolation. How do these distinct layers talk to each other?
Now we drop back into the architecture, tier 3, the compound constants.
This is where we start seeing the names of famous physicists. Boltzmann, Planck, Newton.
Yes. And the paper makes a very firm foundational claim here that contradicts how we usually teach physics.
Which is?
Compound constants do not generate domains from nothing.
What does that mean in practice?
It means the domain of microscopic energy and the domain of macroscopic temperature must already exist as emergent realities before a constant can relate them. A compound constant is simply the numerical trace of a stable bridge between two previously emerged regimes.
So Ludwig Boltzmann didn't discover the math that creates heat.
No. Boltzmann's constant, K sub B, stabilizes the bridge between microscopic energy variation, the chaotic, jittery movement of individual atoms, and macroscopic thermodynamic order, which we humans experience as temperature and entropy.
It's the translator between two different scales of reality.
Exactly.
Imagine you are standing on a bridge. On one side of the river, you have a bustling, chaotic crowd of microscopic individuals all vibrating at different speeds.
Right.
On the other side of the river, you have the overall temperature of the room. Boltzmann's constant is the structural bridge that allows the math of the microscopic crowd to perfectly, flawlessly translate into the math of the macroscopic room.
It connects domains that have already achieved their own internal closure. That is the fundamental definition of a compound constant in this framework.
Let's look at another bridge. Planck's constant. This is the ultimate number in quantum mechanics. What two sides of the river is it bridging?
Planck's constant bridges continuous recurrence, which we observe as wave frequency, and discrete energetic projection, which is quantized action.
So you have the smooth, continuous flowing wave of energy frequency on one side, and the discrete, choppy, packet-like nature of a photon on the other.
Yes.
Planck's constant is the toll booth on that bridge. It regulates exactly how a continuous rhythm gets chopped up into quantized action.
It stabilizes the relationship between the wave and the particle natures of reality. Now consider the gravitational constant, G.
This is where I really need you to break it down, because I've always thought of Newton's G as just a multiplier.
Most people do.
Like, you take mass 1, multiply it by mass 2, divide by the distance squared, and then you just multiply by g to make the units work out, so you get newtons of force. It tells you how fast an apple falls. How does this framework view it as a bridge?
Because we have to ask what G is actually doing in the geometry of the universe. We have to look past Newton to Einstein's general relativity. The framework views G as a profound architectural bridge. It doesn't just measure a localized pulling force. It bridges localized mass density with relational attraction and large-scale curvature closure.
Wait, walk me through the two sides of that bridge.
On one side of the bridge, you have localized mass.
Right.
An apple, a planet, a star, a heavy knot of energy.
Right.
On the other side of the bridge, you have the overall geometry of spacetime, the curvature of the entire universe itself.
Oh, wow.
The gravitational constant is the stabilized mathematical bridge that dictates exactly how that local mass gets to participate in and warp the large-scale geometric structure of reality. It connects the local object to the universal fabric.
So it's not just a localized, invisible tether pulling two rocks together.
No.
It's the translation matrix between the dense stuff right here and the bending shape of the entire universe everywhere else.
It is a relational coefficient of closure. It ensures that mass and space remain mathematically coherent with each other.
This is radically changing how I view these numbers. What about the fine structure constant, alpha? This one always seems to have an aura of mystery around it in physics circles.
It does. Richard Feynman famously called it one of the greatest damn mysteries of physics.
Why is it such a mystery?
The mystery comes from the fact that it is a dimensionless number. Its value is roughly 1 over 137. Most constants have units meters per second, joules per Kelvin, newtons.
But alpha doesn't.
Alpha doesn't. It is a pure, naked ratio. And in this framework, it is viewed as a magnificent multidimensional bridge.
Okay.
It gathers fundamental charge, the speed of light, and quantum action all into a single numerical trace of electromagnetic coupling.
It's like a massive multi-lane highway interchange. It brings together the speed of light from relativity, the charge of an electron from electromagnetism, and Planck's constant from quantum mechanics, and synthesizes them into a single stable proportion that dictates exactly how light interacts with matter.
Yes.
And if that ratio was even slightly different, atomic bonds wouldn't form, and chemistry wouldn't exist.
It is the stabilized, dimensionless bridge that allows the electromagnetic universe to function. A condensed relational signature of multiple underlying emergent domains.
Incredible. And the paper outlines a few more key bridges, Avogadro's constant and the gas constant.
These form a paired bridge. Avogadro's constant bridges discrete particle counts with aggregate molar scale.
Right.
It allows reality to mathematically scale up from individual uncountable atoms to usable macro amounts of chemistry.
And the gas constant.
The gas constant extends that exact bridge into thermodynamics, relating that aggregate particle quantity to macroscopic states we can feel, like pressure and volume.
They are the bridges that let atomic ontology become chemistry and let chemistry become thermodynamics.
Yes, and finally, the largest, most expansive bridge of all, the cosmological constant, lambda.
Einstein's famous addition to his equations, which he once called his biggest blunder.
Right. but which modern astrophysics now relies on to explain dark energy.
So how does the framework view lambda?
Here, lambda is understood not as a blunder, but as the ultimate large-scale bridge between vacuum structure, curvature closure, and cosmic expansion.
That's a huge bridge.
It marks the measurable relation between the baseline, invisible coherence of the quantum vacuum, and the geometric acceleration and expansion of the entire universe.
So tier 3, these compound constants, they are the architectural load-bearing beams of reality. They don't make the fundamental bricks, but they hold the distinct emerged rooms of the universe together so the whole house doesn't fall down.
They are the architecture of emergent relations.
Which finally, after climbing all this way, brings us to the top of the pyramid, the surface. Tier 5, empirical constants.
These are the numbers we actually measure in a laboratory.
It's the exact speed of light in a vacuum, c. The specific mass of an electron, m sub e.
The paper defines these as the final measurable residues.
Residues. That word feels so intentional, like dust left over after a chemical reaction.
It is. And this is the ultimate paradigm shift of the entire coherence closure framework.
How?
Standard physics treats these measurements as the absolute foundation of reality. We measure the speed of light and say, aha, this is the foundational rule of the universe.
Right.
But Lilien's framework reveals that they are merely the projected outcomes of all the deeper structures we just spent the last hour discussing. Measurement is the final stage of reality, not its origin.
If we connect this back to our very first analogy, physical law isn't a flat list of independent equations on a contractor's invoice. It's a single, deeply interconnected architecture.
Yes.
And what we measure in a multi-billion-dollar particle accelerator isn't the root of reality. It's just the final, stabilized shadow cast by the root.
That is the exact implication. Empirical constants are where deeper, unseen mathematical invariance finally becomes numerically visible to human instruments.
Only at the very end.
They are the fixed values that appear only after emergence has completely stabilized into measurable form.
And this leads directly to the central metaphor of the paper, which gives us the title of our deep dive today. Constants are fossils.
It is a brilliant, clarifying analogy. The empirical constants we measure are the fossils of emergence.
Let's expand on that. Why fossils? What is Philip Lilien trying to evoke with that imagery?
Think about what a physical fossil is in geology. A dinosaur bone sitting in a museum isn't a living, breathing creature.
No, it's rock.
It doesn't move, it doesn't eat. It is a petrified, preserved record. It tells you about a dynamic, living biological process from the distant past.
Okay, I see.
In the exact same way, the physical constants we measure today are preserved mathematical records showing exactly where pure coherence survived the incredibly violent journey of projection, stabilization, and closure to become measurable reality.
There are the petrified remains of the universe's birth process. Just like a fossilized fern tells a paleontologist about the ancient climate, the soil acidity, and the biology of the plant, an empirical constant like the mass of an electron tells a physicist about the generative emergence of the universe. It secretly encodes a massive, deeper derivation history. It encodes the root coherence conditions, the recursive modulation across fields, the dimensional projection rules, and the final compound stabilization.
Constants become measurable when invariance survives projection. The specific value of the speed of light, 299,792,458 meters per second, or the precise mass of an electron, are the final stable residues detected in our specific laboratory regime.
They aren't just random facts.
No, they are not unexplained terminal facts handed down by a creator. They are the visible, petrified signatures of a much deeper generative order that we can now theoretically map.
This completely flips the script on the future of science. Instead of physics just being the pursuit of building bigger machines to measure these numbers with more decimal points of accuracy, science becomes a theoretical archaeological dig.
That's exactly what it becomes.
We should be using the measured numbers to dig downward, through the compound bridges, through the transcendent mathematical grammar, through the recursive echoes, all the way down to the root seeds of existence.
It provides an entirely new ontological foundation for a derivation program in theoretical physics. We don't just ask what is the exact value of this mass. We ask, how did this specific value mathematically survive the process of emergence?
Okay, let's take a collective breath and recap this incredible journey.
It's been a lot.
We started with a flat, confusing list of numbers that standard physicists use as a blind cheat sheet for the universe, and we expanded it into a 5-tier living architecture.
Right.
We started at the absolute pre-empirical bottom with the seed equations in layer 1, pure mathematical coherence, unity from nothingness, the generative spark of asymmetry, and the bounding of infinite potential to create space.
From there, we cross the thresholds, establishing the rules where quantum envelopes are bound, where observation forces reality to collapse into solid form, where subjectivity and consciousness can mathematically mirror itself, and where the modulation of coherence creates the flow of time.
We watched those foundational rules modulate through the recursive layers, playing the exact same mathematical melody across quantum fields, chemistry, and biology, all governed rigidly by the transcendental math of pi, e, and phi to ensure reality didn't lose its shape.
Then we walked across the massive compound bridges, Boltzmann, Planck, gravity, the fine structure constant that architecturally stabilize the relationships between heat, quantum action, mass, and cosmic expansion.
And finally, we arrived at the surface where human beings live, measuring the empirical fossils, the speed of light, the mass of particle.
The petrified, stable residues of that entire breathtaking generative process.
It is not a list of numbers. It is an architecture of relations.
It is reality emerging sequentially from pure logic, and humanity finally developing the framework to map the true depth of that sequence.
Which leaves me with one final, deeply provocative thought, something for you, the listener, to mull over as you go about your day in this highly structured, mathematically stabilized universe. We've spent the last hour talking about how these fundamental physics constants are fossils of a completed emergence process that built physical reality billions of years ago.
Right.
But the framework explicitly mentions recursive constants passing through the layers of biology, cognition, and even civilization.
It does.
So if the physical constants we measure today are just the fossils of a completed physical emergence, what active, dynamic, wildly fluid processes are happening in human consciousness or in global human civilization right now that might one day stabilize and solidify into the permanent constants of an entirely new layer of reality?
That is a fascinating question.
Are we right now, with our internet, our cultures, our collective minds, just the active, fluid state of a future universal fossil?
It fundamentally forces us to ask whether the process of emergence ever actually stops, or if we are just the universe currently building its next conceptual tier.
It makes you look at everything differently. We started this deep dive talking about X-rays, about how standard physics is like a doctor pointing at a jagged white line on a black background saying, there it is, there's the speed of light, there's gravity, deal with it.
Yeah.
But Philip Lilien's coherence closure framework isn't saying the standard X-ray is broken. It's saying we finally invented the MRI.
We are finally seeing the soft tissue, the interconnected circulatory systems, the deep, generative, mathematical pulse that gives birth to the bones themselves.
We are finally looking past the operation to see the ontology.
And it is absolutely beautiful.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. Until next time, keep questioning the numbers and keep digging into the depths.